Sacrifice and offering thou didst not desire. Mine ears hast thou opened. Burnt offering and sin offering hast thou not required. Then said I, Lo, I come. In the volume of the book it's written of me. I delight to do thy will, O my God. Yea, thy law is within my heart. I have preached righteousness in the great congregation. Lo, I have not refrained my lips. O Lord, thou knowest. I haven't hid thy righteousness within my heart. I have declared thy faithfulness and thy salvation. I haven't concealed thy loving kindness and thy truth from the great congregation. Withhold not thou thy tender mercies from me, O Lord. Let thy loving kindness and thy truth continually preserve me. The reference is obviously messianic. The corrupt Septuagint, written many years after the completion of the New Testament, lifts Hebrew chapter 10 verse 5 bodily out of its setting and rewrites the Hebrew text used by the Masoretes, inserting body, for ears hast thou opened. There doesn't exist on this earth one Greek manuscript of Psalm chapter 40 verse 6 written before Anno Domini 150. The manuscript used in the Septuagint at this point is the Vatican manuscript in Rome written in Anno Domini 330, which is more than 200 years after the last apostle was dead. In order for the writer of Hebrews to quote the Greek Septuagint of Psalm chapter 40 verse 6, he had to be born not any earlier than Anno Domini 250. There are 4 great offerings in the verse, and they show that Christ's sacrifice fulfilled the law to the jot and tittle. These offerings were the meal offering, the burnt offering, the sin offering, and the trespass offering. Mine ears hast thou opened is a literal reference to Isaiah chapter 50, verse 4 to 5. Doctrinally, the reference is to Exodus, where the servant, Exodus chapter 21, verses 5 to 7, stays in his master's house because he loves his master, his wife, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 23, and his children, Hebrews chapter 2, verse 13. You would think that when these incredible thinkers had altered child to servant in Acts chapter 4, 27, they could have found their cross references, but they couldn't. In many Bibles, this child is moved to word servant, or some Bibles, this child has moved as a son. God required no temple sacrifices from his son, verse 6, for his son was the sacrifice. In the volume of the book it's written of me. It's where? What volume? We assume it's the law of Moses because of John chapter 5, verse 46. But where does one find in the law of Moses? I delight to do thy will, O my God. Yeah, thy law is within my heart. What book is this? A lost, verbal inspired original autograph? What if the book included the book of Psalms? Someone is taking for granted that there are no psalms, or at least no collection of them, until David shows up. He may be called the sweet psalmist, 2 Samuel chapter 23 verse 1 of Israel, but Moses has a psalm, Psalm 90, written more than 500 years before David was born. In addition, Moses speaks of a book that God had written before he wrote Exodus chapter 32, verse 32. Now look at Psalm 119, which has no known author. Thy word have I hid in my heart, Psalm chapter 119, verse 11. I shall keep thy law, verse 33. So shall I keep thy law, verse 44. I will delight myself in thy commandments, verse 47. I will keep thy precepts with my whole heart, verse 69. They that fear thee will be glad when they see me, verse 74. They are the rejoicing of my heart, verse 111. I have inclined my heart, verse 112. I am thy servant, verse 125. All my ways are before thee, verse 168. The speaker, like Christ, is God's servant. The speaker, like Christ, has the law in his heart. The speaker, like Christ, is about to show up where someone can see him. And finally, he delights in keeping the commandments. A volume that includes Psalm 119 is a much better bet than a volume that contains Genesis to Deuteronomy. Speaking doctrinally, it was God's will for him to become sin for us. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21. Our flesh can be repulsed by the will of God. We can fear the will of God and even instinctively, adamically, draw back from the very things that our new nature delights. In Romans chapter 7, verse 15. Verse 9 goes with Hebrews chapter 2, verse 12, and Psalm 68, verse 11, and tells us that a New Testament preacher shouldn't refrain his lips from telling all the counsel of God. Acts chapter 20, verse 27. A preacher must freely preach of God's righteousness, verse 9, his faithfulness, verse 10, his salvation, verse 10, his loving kindness, verse 10, and above all his truth, verse 10. For he came to bear witness of the truth, John chapter 18, verse 37, and said that his father's word was truth, John chapter 17, verse 17. As God's righteousness, Romans chapter 10, verse 3, Jesus Christ doesn't hide his righteousness, verse 10. He openly manifests it, John chapter 8, verse 46, and tells the great congregation, verse 10, that unless their righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, Matthew chapter 5, verse 20, Paul, Philippians chapter 3, verses 4 to 6, they will not get into the kingdom of heaven when it comes. Verse 11 is saying in effect, let what I have preached preserve me. Compare it with verse 10. For innumerable evils have compassed me about, mine iniquities have taken hold upon me, so that I am not able to look up. They are more than the hairs of mine head, therefore my heart faileth me. Be pleased, O Lord, to deliver me. O Lord, make haste to help me. Let them be ashamed and confounded together that seek after my soul to destroy it. Let them be driven backward and put to shame that wish me evil. Let them be desolate for the reward of their shame, that say unto me, Aha, aha. Let all those that seek thee rejoice and be glad in thee. Let such as love thy salvation say continually, The Lord be magnified. But I am poor and needy, yet the Lord thinketh upon me. Thou art my help and my deliverer. Make no tarrying, O my God. Obviously, David is speaking of himself in verse 12, but you wouldn't see this if you were not rightly dividing the word of truth. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15. Verse 13 is self-explanatory, as are verses 14 and 15. See Psalm chapter 35, verse 21, Psalm 38, verse 22, and Psalm 70, verses 1 to 5. There are about 120,000 hairs in the average head, verse 12. So if you have more sins than that, you are in condition for sure. Still, most Americans would commit at least 10 sins a day: lustful thoughts, wandering eyes, self-pity, self-exaltation, laziness, exaggeration, overeating, etc., which would be 3,650 a year or 36,500 in 10 years. One doesn't have to have a computer to see that you will hit 120,000 sins long before you have lived out your 70. You would pass it in 40 years. For those against the Lord and his Christ, Acts chapter 4 verse 26, we have 1. Shame, verse 14, 2. Confounding, verse 14, and verse 14, a driving backward. For those who love the Lord and his Christ, there is rejoicing, 1. 2. Gladness, verse 16. 3. The ability to praise God, verse 1. Again in verse 17, the tribulation theme reoccurs. Let us say, make no tarrying, O my God.